Great. Okay. So we'll kick off. Our main focus and topics of today will be homework and bits of change management. So moving from secondary schools, mainly is the main focus from today. Obviously moving any school though, really. So we've lots of students that may transition between school and school. So, these things apply in that instance also. So I'm going to move these to the bigger screen, and please let me know if they freeze. I know sometimes it can act up and there's so many people on the call. So if I'm talking ahead from what you see, please let me know as soon as possible. So just a little bit of a background. I know some of you would have been on previously, and some obviously are meeting you for the very first time, so welcome aboard. I'm Una Buckley, and I run Blossom for Life. So we work with a wide range of organisations over the last number of years. I'm also dyslexic myself, and I have dyscalculia and dysgraphia. So because I went through an awful lot of it myself, I'm very conscious and trying to help pave that way forward. So we work with students of a wide range of backgrounds, wide range of ages, from dyslexia to autism, everything and anything in between, all age groups, but mainly obviously in the school age group category. So our primary and secondary and third level students are the main cohort of students that we work with. Very much linked into, I suppose, a holistic and well-being focused, and you'll see that throughout today's workshop of some of our practical tips and suggestions around homework, around change and transitions are very much from a wellness base of how do we support a student or a child in the best way for it. Obviously, they can't learn in a school environment if they don't have that wellness piece already ingrained. And we do a range of different, offerings working with students and teachers and parents, and we'll look at some of those at the end if anybody's interested in further work with us from that side. Okay, so just for 2 seconds, if everybody gets out phone, I'm sure you all have phones, their laptops to hand. And we have one of our first questions from today's workshop. I'm sure some of you, I know some of you have already been on both of our Instagram and Facebook. But on the story at the moment, if anybody could get the question and shout out to me whenever they've gotten it. And we may have to link in with the page in order to be able to do that. I will ask you all again, guys, if you can go on mute. There are still one or two that aren't on mute. Anybody found our questions yet for today's session? Oh, perfect. They're all in the chat. Great. Everybody shy. I don't want to call out the question. Yes. Okay. So Donna's saying yes, more boys. So are you agreeing with this statement? Is it, Donna, or are you disputing it?
Oh, no, I'm agreeing with it.
Okay. Right. So you think boys are more
boys,
prone or have detection than dyslexia. Okay. Anybody else have any perspectives on that? Do people think similar things?
I think we're told more boys have it than girls, but I wonder, is it girls are just so much better at masking that we're all slipping underneath the radar?
Yeah, so it's definitely a mix. Thanks on that side, guys. There actually is no scientific backing or proving to show that boys are more inclined or have, being more tested or assessments or whatever terminology you want to give it. Generally speaking, obviously there's many traits. There is a genetic link, and there's so many other strands to it that make it a little bit more complex. But by no means there is an uneven gender split, and that's a common one. Lots of people, I suppose, think that, and I think for a long time people were told that as well. So it's about kind of, I suppose, staying in that remit of, okay, as things change and evolve, particularly as we move on to the assistive technology piece, as things change, which is so radical anymore, and we get so much information and then it changes to, it's kind of in bits of the space too. It's kind of never ending learning, I suppose, really. So what we'll look at, and I'm going to just go through a little bit of definitions with you. Sorry, I have loads of questions in the chat, so the thing has gone a bit KWAL. Okay, we'll do a small bit of background just for some people maybe that don't have a detailed understanding or a detailed overview. I know some are coming on just to get a general overview and maybe don't have a personal instance of dyslexia or other learning differences. So a little bit on dyscalculia front. So dyscalculia, the common misconception for dyscalculia is that it only affects maths. And dyscalculia is growing in terms of assessments, in terms of detections in school, and in terms of lots of different things really. The student with dyscalculia can also have, spelling difficulties, can also have difficulties with reading. It's not just a link in with obviously numbers and awareness from that side. There obviously can be another range of strands, as you mentioned here. So time, signs and symbols, fractions, sequencing, so coordination, balance a little bit, which often then can be misdiagnosed as, dyspraxia, and lots of other strands, and posture and fatigue. Okay, so posture and fatigue, we look at a little bit of this as we move through homework and we move through other, strands as we go through today's workshop. But definitely posture is a really valid and important one for particularly our younger students. If they're sitting at a desk so much throughout the school day and hunched over, and then they're coming home to do homework, which we'll address also, it's very much about setting up that environment in the best way to support them as much as possible. Now, from the dyscalculia piece, so the dyscalculia side is still very much under the radar, as I'm sure most of people are aware here in Ireland. We still get, they might go for this assessment, but they've no idea, bits and pieces of what it entails. And that's very common because obviously we're, told and kind of, pushed a little bit at from the dyslexia space, and the others have kind of fallen behind the wayside. So not a lot of people will know, different strands of dyscalculia, especially actually in a teacher setting. So we might have mentioned this previously, but it's really important to reiterate that a teacher can move through their qualification training without any understanding or any modules in learning differences. So teachers still at the moment that will qualify in a primary and a secondary school setting never have to actually learn a level of detail about dyslexia, not only to learn how to manage it, how to deal with it. Some of it is left up to them to do their own further research and training. Most students obviously use time and logistics. That might not always be possible. So it is very much, kind of subject to the teacher and their level of interest as to how they evolve and how they kind of move through. Now I'm just going to stop this for 2 seconds. Okay, so bits on dysgraphia. I'm going to leave the slides like this, guys, if that's okay, because I'm getting loads of questions, so it's confusing my own dyslexia and orientation. So the dysgraphia piece is more linked to handwriting. Okay, so this is where speech to text software will come in. So a little bit on the assistive technology side, we use speech to text and text to speech software. Okay, lots of students can benefit from one or either or both, depending upon their level of assessment or non-assessment to date. Definitely the assistive technology, laptops, dictating, C-pens. I'm not sure lots of people are aware of C-pens. We looked at this previously, but they're very more common now. Any of those pieces can be massively helpful. What I would say is that, that's a very gradual approach, and lots of times in an initial assessment with an education psychologist, they can outline, many, many suggestions and many, many pieces of software. They would ideally like to be phased, and generally speaking, we only want 2 or 3 pieces of software at any one given time that a student is using, because too many pieces of software leads to overwhelm. Most of them are quite expensive, and then they don't get used. So it's the practical ongoing implementation of pieces of software. Now, software varies. So let's say the C-pen, I've loads of students at the moment that have purchased or been given a C-pen either through the department or their parents at home, and they don't actually use it. I've some that, very much use it and use it every day. So it is very subjective. I wouldn't say, unfortunately, by any means, one size fits all with lots of these things. It is a trial and error. So ideally moving back to the school, liaising with the resource teachers or liaising with, school principal and seeing, what resources are there that can be trialed in a school setting before purchasing them would be the best bet on that side. Mind maps, grips and hand grasps. We'll look at bits of these as we move through, but just an overview on the dysgraphia piece. Okay, let's fire through on bits of homework suggestions. So obviously, some bits of this is for a homework in a general basis, let's say on a daily basis for any age group. And some bits of this is, let's say, from a transition, again, from a primary to secondary school, or from a primary to a new school, or as we even move older, as we move through the system. Some bits are basic, obviously, and some bits are a little bit more tricky to get the grasp of. So the main thing for students with learning differences, no matter what age group they are at, is usually that remembering piece in a short-term and a long-term memory. So it doesn't always have to be written to a homework journal. Sometimes I have students that bring in like a whiteboard version and then they put it in a plastic pocket so it doesn't rub off. And it's probably the best approach really to some level if the school are cooperative to have a teacher and print out some element of the homework and hand it to the student. So every day, or if it's a week in advance, ideally the best approach. So then they don't have to write it down from the board. If they've an SNA or somebody that's assisting them, or in a classroom SNA, then ideally them having that responsibility will alleviate that pressure of, is it page number 12 or is it maths question 21, which is a regular occurrence. Also, usually when homework's taken down, there generally is an element of stress in a classroom. So some teachers kind of have a different approach with doing this, hopefully over the last while. But usually it's given towards the end of the day. Some students might be packing up bits and pieces. They may have just been finishing art, and the teacher's at the top of the room trying to get students to take down homework. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes it's given in advance and that process is an awful lot easier. But generally speaking, it can be given in a time constrained fashion. But for somebody that has a learning difference, that element of stress or that element of kind of heightened anxiety can make it way more difficult then to take down the accuracy of what page numbers, what do we need to do, when do we need to do it by. Homework is an online platform. Obviously, with COVID, this was obviously done very regularly. Obviously for secondary school students, so most of them use Microsoft Teams. Very rarely actually anymore do we have students that actually take down homework in secondary school. Again, varies from school to school and teacher to teacher, but most now they have their school, let's say normal day, and then the teachers put up the homework even towards the end of the school day. So they don't actually even know what homework that they've been given. So there's that element of, right, if it's online, it might be a little bit easier, but then there's that rigidity of checking it regularly. Again, this is more from a secondary school perspective, but doing it when it's due versus actually the evening that you get it. So we try and work with students, obviously, when they change from that primary to secondary school mindset of, oh, I don't have English now until Friday, I don't need to do it until then. And then they figure out they have to do football and they have to do all of these other things throughout the week. And then before they know it, it's Thursday evening. So that's very much a balancing act, as to when to do and what to do when. We have the prioritization piece that we'll look at shortly. But obviously, ideally, the sooner we can get it finished and out of the way, the sooner then leaves time for other things and other enjoyable activities. And a dedicated space. So ideally having a set dedicated space for all students where possible is the most advised approach. So again, this is very much conditioned based upon circumstances and space provided and allocated obviously within a home setting. But generally speaking, doesn't have to be anyway big. It can be a small desk in the corner of a room, or it can be some of those foldable ones. IKEA is great for any of those, a foldable desk or foldable chairs that can be stacked away. But having a set dedicated space creates that element of focus for a student no matter what age they are, so that they know that that's my space to do bits of my homework, or if an older student, she bits my study, and then it's dedicated to that. So when I leave, I don't need to keep thinking about it. Ideally, if possible, outside of a bedroom is very useful, because there's that element that links over with downtime versus, a set kind of homework space. Okay, complicated task versus non-complicated tasks. So this varies for us from student to student. We have some that are like, right, let's get the difficult ones done first, and then others that want to always put them to the end. Generally speaking, with students that have learning differences, they underestimate time, right? And that's kind of a common enough fact for most students, with the different elements that maybe they need to contend with. So when a student pushes something to the end, let's say a maths problem or a maths question, there's usually an element that they feel like that's going to take longer, or that's harder for me to do. And what happens is, if we move through the 40 minutes, or sometimes even closer to an hour or an awful lot longer for some of the students, they're tireder and tireder. The stress levels are a little bit more increased. And then the estimation of time is difficult. So they're like, well, I thought I was going to get done. I need to now go off and go to training or whatever else, and it's crammed. So the best thing and the best approach really is trying best as possible to do the difficult ones first, and then everything else after that, at times hopefully seems a little bit easier. Timers and time limits. So this is something really, I suppose, that has to be kind of specific to the student. It's hard to say, what one size fits all for this. Some are the students that we work with like egg timers because they don't like the noise and there's a sensory element. Some will like to just track it on a watch, but ideally setting some element of a time scope of, right, okay, we're starting this at this time. When do we want to finish this task by? And at a younger age, obviously, they need to kind of develop that skill and pattern. So to be taught and shown at home how to do bits of that. But the idea is then obviously as they're older in a secondary school environment, there's more subjects, there's more things going on, that pattern then is retained so that the student then knows, okay, how do I manage my time for this evening? Because we have some students that unfortunately deviate from time an awful lot and then spend hours and hours endlessly on homework, interferes with, extracurriculars and lots of other strands in their life. So we want to set that time limit. And then after that time limit is reached, and if it's still not finished, okay, where are we at with that? And can we go back into the teacher and say, well, we spent X amount of minutes on it or half an hour, it's still not where you'd like it to be. What then is realistic? So how do we then reorganize the homework that's been given so that it's not consistently overwhelming or it's not consistently taking so much of the day? Taking breaks between tasks, that obviously goes without saying, or usually try and do this after a subject. So particularly when students move from English, let's say, to maths, so from numbers usually to words. Students move from languages to languages as well is very important. But generally speaking, from numbers to words is a very optimal time. And this could be only like 2 minutes. I always do, like, we run up and down the stairs, or they go outside and they come back in. Doesn't have to be by any means 5 or 10 minutes. Obviously distraction levels and focus levels can be interfered with during that space. So it's a very short, snappy, get up and move and then come back in and we get the rest of it finished. Taking the break when they come in is definitely something I'd really suggest. So obviously that varies depending upon commuting and how much time is needed before they go off and do swimming and all of those things. So it might not always be possible, but sometimes even just 5 minutes is enough. That little bit of a reprieve from a long school day, for no matter what age the student is in primary or secondary school, can be really draining and tiring. So going straight into homework, we have some students over the last while try and even do their homework in the car, and the quality obviously of the homework, but their stress levels afterwards are still quite high. So ideally giving that few minutes or ideally a little bit longer of unwind time is definitely needed. And then that communication with the teachers. So even in parent teacher meetings or a little bit before that, setting a little bit of a plan as to, their term homework or even their weekly homework, as what optimal type of time should they be spending on some of these tasks before teachers actually set some of a time limit. Some schools do this still, some schools don't. But ideally, should this take 10 minutes? And then if somebody's doing it for half an hour or 40 minutes, then we either need to pivot on bits of that homework, it needs to be shortened, or it needs to be eradicated completely if it's not obviously becoming more effective and rewarding. Prioritization of tasks. So as I mentioned, doing things first as best as possible and leaving other things to last. Try not to let it interfere with other activities. So this is where the timer piece comes in, and especially it's a very good skill for secondary students to retain and hold, because as they move through a little bit more towards junior cert, I've loads of kids at the moment doing their freeze and their mock tests. And there's that lax of, okay, well, I'm not fully finished now doing this topic, let me not go to that this evening. That affects energy levels, sleep, everything across the board, mood, and that downtime is definitely needed. So for that student to establish where their boundary is and where their cutoff is within reason, obviously not always the case, and there is exceptions to the rule, but for them to develop that autonomy and skill as best as possible, kind of pre-teens and definitely as a teenager, is very, very important so that they can maintain that overall balance and well-being. The homework piece obviously is very controversial at the moment, okay, so I won't fully get into all the ins and outs of it. Obviously, it is subject to change, has been for many, many years, and thankfully it's kind of making a little bit more of headlines currently at the moment. I would presume that there will be radical shifts in the next while, and how long that takes and how long that maintains itself for is subject to a crystal ball. But definitely, I suppose, it can benefit some students and it can be obviously non-effective for other students. Okay, we'll do a little bit on the writing and the spelling pieces, because obviously that's very much linked into homework as an ongoing battle, and then we'll kind of move into a secondary school. Now, I titled it secondary school, but it's very appropriate for children moving in any context. So there's just practical tips around then how do we transition. So planning out pieces, mind maps. So we do a video in our online program, which I'll speak to you about at the end, that teaches a set way to do mind maps. So mind maps is a common misconception that mind maps work, you know, for everybody and just do them any way they want to. Generally, that's not really the case. So researchers show that for students with a different way of learning, a mind map actually has to be set out in a particular way. I kind of figured that out myself in my own studies and my own academia experience, but we would work with, you know, some researchers, and they've developed a little bit more of a technique around this. So I don't fully have time to get into it today, but we can definitely follow up on it if people are interested in learning a little bit more about that full outline. But just being aware that as students integrate with mind maps, it may not always be the most effective if not done in a specific way for them. Grips and handwriting grips, again linking in with if there's any elements of dysgraphia, or, you know, holding a pen or holding a pencil can be very challenging. Color pages, line pages, they go without saying, obviously, that they can be very useful for some students. We actually have students at the moment, and obviously they're moving through transition year or in secondary school, that maybe don't take to those as much, so they're using them a little bit more at home. And I would definitely suggest that, you know, that might be a useful strand for, you know, a short-term fix. That if a student, maybe a boy, is a little bit more reluctant to being in a classroom with coloured pages and coloured stuff, that can be used at home to learn things off, or can be used to home to, you know, understand pieces of paper or understand different concepts on the page, and then not used in a school setting for a short-term basis if they find that, you know, drawing too much attention. Visual storyboards, general layout, and then obviously typing if needed. So typing, I'm sure lots of you are aware, loads of different typing websites, typing.com, Nessie obviously from a younger age group perspective, and then typing.com from an older age group perspective. Obviously, a student, you know, if they have handwriting concerns or handwriting issues from a young age, generally speaking, they don't get eradicated, you know, and you can practice, and we can do handwriting books, you know, morning, noon, and night. But generally speaking, their handwriting speed and eligibility will fluctuate depending upon their stress and depending upon their workload. So as quick as we can to move to a typing platform and move to a typing base, if that is suggested in a report or in the school, the easier that becomes. So the more it's included in everyday life, the easier then the transition will be. Whereas what's happening in recently is we've some secondary school students that didn't really take to the typing in primary, and then finding a little bit more challenging. They're moving now towards their exams, and they're finding it difficult because they're so used now to writing all of the time, they don't know how to integrate into the typing. So as quick as a student can make that transition, the better it'll be for them, really. It's kind of like one of those things of like just biting the bullet and going all in for it. We'll never be able to, I always get this wrong, we'll never be able to handwrite as fast as we can type. So there'll never be a speed of anybody on the planet that will be able to handwrite to that level of typing speed. So it is definitely advantageous to a student if they can practice and they can type out things, type out a shopping list. It doesn't always have to be typing games or, you know, anything from that side. It can be daily activities. But the more and more they type and the more they become familiar with the keyboard, the better it'll be for them, obviously, in an exam setting. Okay. Spelling strategies. So we'll briefly run through these, and we've looked at these in our last workshop, but I know lots of people wanted us to go back over these anyway, and it kind of gets a lot of traction usually. So our spelling strategies, we have a range of different spelling approaches we use when we work with students directly. So the bubble approach sometimes can be very useful for our smaller children, obviously, you know, outlining the word in a different shape. The cat and the bottle, the step number 2, can be very useful actually for students that, you know, really like the element of something coming off the page a little. So as we know, kind of black and white or black and blue text can be often very boring, particularly for younger students that maybe likes color or are very creative. So that mix of letters can be very useful. Now, what we would suggest with this is that it is usually done on a letter that they find difficult. So what I mean by that is, let's say the cat there, the C and the T are in blue and the A is in red. I wouldn't always suggest red, but it's just for this example, it's in red. So generally, if they, common misconception, but can be possible, B's and D's, or if there's G's or whatever letter maybe a student finds challenging or finding, constantly difficult, that then to go in a different color. So then that kind of stands out for them a little bit more. The rainbow approach, the stairs, some of these are self-explanatory, so I won't go through all of them, so we have enough time to go through all of your questions. Writing with the wrong hand, this can be actually more entertaining. We've lots of students that just try this just because they want a bit of a break. And then rhyming. Okay, so a little bit on the secondary school transitions. So timetables. Timetables can obviously be extremely challenging for most of us, but in a set way that a secondary school timetable is drafted up can be very, very confusing. It also is often regularly subject to change as well. So a student may be given a timetable and then may put loads of work into it, and then it might change actually within the next few days of them starting school. So reading them can be very difficult, and often they're not given a lot of time to go through some of these. So if it's on the initial day that they arrive into the school, or if it's like 2 or 3 hours of an induction session, it usually is quite flippant, and they're kind of expected to know quite quickly how to read it and not know where everything is, but they're kind of expected to figure it out. So definitely what we suggest with students that we have moving schools and transitioning into secondary schools and even transitioning into colleges is rewriting them. So rewriting them in their own format, rewriting them with colours, rewriting them on a laptop, and then printing them out in a different version that's useful for them. And then what we do with that best as possible, laminating them or trying to put them in plastic pockets, because we know that, anything can crinkle and, bend very, very easily. And multiple copies, then it's very useful. So we always suggest students put one in the locker if they have access to the locker, and keep some of them at home. Put one in the front of your homework journal if that, is big enough from that size. And then within, a few weeks, they're usually quite parfait with it and will know what is on and when. But that can cause a huge amount of stress, because obviously you're moving from a primary school where there has been no such thing really as a timetable into a way more of an autonomy role where you're kind of responsible for getting yourself to a class at a set time, which can be very difficult. So I would say the timetables, with a few other aspects that we look at today, but timetables can cause the most amount of apprehension for students while they're getting used to it. Okay, directions to getting around school. Obviously, this, is an ongoing thing. Unfortunately, there's no quick fix for this. Every school is different. Every school varies in size, has different, obviously, orientation. And we suggest students, especially if they're moving to a school where they don't know anybody in there, trying to obviously become as familiar with the school as possible. So thankfully, over the last while, obviously in COVID, it's been very different. But over the last while, I think schools have been a little bit more open in that respect. I've loads of students that would go in now and view a school separately and walk around. They might even go in a few days before that the school starts again in September, and become familiar with bits and pieces, either be shown around or given a set time that they can, walk around while secretaries are on or anything from that side. So that kind of lack of, you're all in now, this is day one, and more of that transition piece would be very useful. Then if there is nobody else obviously going into the school, ideally, the friend process and trying to, form that as early as possible, so that then they can kind of have that buddy support system that they can go around, and they might know certain classrooms and you might know some other classrooms, and then kind of, make it up along the way. And then that giving time element. So I think what students find the most challenging is that they're nearly expected to know everything quite quickly when they go into secondary school, because they can see obviously other years and see how easy it is for them that have already transitioned, and they forget at times that they've been here now an awful lot longer. They have X amount of years or X amount of months to get used to all of these things. So that reiteration of it just started or it's just happened, this will take, usually we don't have students fully settled till probably Christmas, and that again varies. Some students take very quickly, some take even the whole first year. but most students will take till about Christmas timeline before they fully are in the swing of things and kind of have their feet in the ground a little bit more. Again, as I mentioned, we do a lot on the wellness piece, but I won't obviously go into major detail about all of these logistics today. I have a nutrition background, so I'm very passionate obviously about students' well-being and focus and food patterns, you know, so obviously our food is essential to our overall concentration and memory retention. So what we consume obviously affects what we can produce in an exam setting or what we can retain and store and study. So you know, that varies in the teenage years, as we all know, and students go in and out of phases, but as best as possible, you know, fluids and obviously some element of, you know, consistent meals would be very useful for them to retain and develop in a school setting. Okay, so we'll do a little bit on the laptop and typing. Now we've addressed this already, but typing programs, typing during the class, I suppose, is the main piece here. So for students that maybe are moving from primary, just got even an assessment and now are going into secondary, or they may either not be moving at all, they may just be in the set class year. That typing during the class can often be a transition for them when they're so used to handwriting. Particularly obviously if there's nobody else typing in a classroom setting, but often even if there is somebody else, you know, on an iPad or on a tablet or even on a laptop and they're already typing and now they're kind of in to do that as well, that can take a lot of, I suppose, figuring out, getting your head around things. And that's as basic as where do we even sit, because we need to maybe sit closer to a plug. You know, those extra elements that a student need to consider on the day, or they move classrooms in secondary school, right? Where do we sit now when we now move to the English classroom? You know, so those extra considerations, I suppose, need to be a little bit pre-planned in a sense, and especially if the student has more tendencies to get anxious and get worried about things, that, you know, as much pre-planning that can go into that, the better for them to, you know, orientate it a little bit more. Typing homework, typing exams, obviously they're self-explanatory. Where to sit in a classroom setting, and again, this doesn't actually fully apply to, you know, transitioning to secondary schools. This is probably across the board. This again varies from student to student. Generally speaking, as a very, very general rule of thumb, ideally as close as possible to the front of the classroom. So that doesn't mean as close as possible now to the teacher. That means, so let's say teachers' desks can be positioned very much differently throughout classrooms. But as close as possible to the front, where let's say it's near a whiteboard, it's near a blackboard, or whatever form of, let's say, media is being illustrated by the teacher. There's many reasons for this, you know, they're possibly closer to the door, they may not necessarily be, but it's that element where you can eliminate all the stuff behind you. So students with maybe ranges of learning differences often get distracted, often they might not, by external noise, but ideally seeing and hearing it creates more distraction than just hearing it. So if there's somebody sitting behind you and they're talking about a particular math sum or something like that, seeing it and also hearing it if they were in front of you creates more of a distraction. So generally speaking, as close to the front of the classroom as possible. Some, and I swear older students like to do this at the moment, sit near a door, sit near a window, sit near a wall, and this may be linked to a posture perspective. So, you know, they want to sit near a wall so they can have their back and they can lean their back against the wall because it has a different, I suppose, frame than sitting in the back of a chair. This again can be, you know, widely disputed and you know, thrown around as a statement and argued back and forth. Generally, obviously, avoiding, you know, looking out the window can be useful, but then some students find that very useful to recharge and unwind. And then obviously the moving seats, but the moving seats doesn't take place as much anymore, obviously with the pandemic, but they have definitely eased a lot of that, both particularly for primary and for secondary school students. So generally most students, maybe once, twice a year, they might move, whereas before it was nearly every few weeks. Subjects, obviously we won't go into all subjects and all the ins and outs of subjects. Okay, we do this, again, I'll speak about this later, but we do have a secondary school workshop that we do with the students themselves, and where we look in more level of detail at subjects and what they'll be looking at to give them a little bit of an overview. I suppose ideally preparing students as much as possible for some element of what the subject might look like. So obviously they've been learning, you know, and have witnessed some element of English, Irish, maths. PE, little bits maybe of history and geography, but they're option subjects. So let's say home ec, art, woodwork, tech, graph, you know, there's so many different options now varying from school to school. Having some visibility as to what that actually looks like from a course perspective really eases the element of uncertainty and anxiety. So I myself, you know, enjoy bits of cooking, and then I was like, oh, let's just do home ec. You know, I had absolutely zero understanding as to what actually was in the syllabus. You know, nobody ever sat down and showed me a little bit before I went into first year. Well, I might have this and it will have that, you know, and it doesn't have to be getting a book or anything from that level. It can literally just be 5-10 minutes every now and then Googling, you know, bits and pieces that are on the course, so then become more familiar. And what happens there is that when then some of the content is looked at in a classroom setting, it's not a shock or it's not a disbelief. It's more like, oh, okay, I kind of knew that was coming up at some stage, and they already feel a little bit more ahead. And our main aim for a student in general, but definitely with dyslexia or any learning differences, is as best as we can to make them feel like a little bit more ahead. Most of our lives we spend trying to catch up. So anything that can be spent with pre-planning kind of gives a little bit more of a confidence boost and gives a little bit more of a stress reliever. Open-minded obviously to new subjects. Lots of students may change subjects within the first week, so that to be accepted a little bit more, that, you know, they weren't fully sure of what subjects they were getting into, and giving them that scope to change and alter is very much useful. Organization. Apologies, I know I'm running through all of these, but we'll get through a few more and then we'll go through some of your questions. So organization, this again varies now from student to student. So this isn't a finite list by any means. We've some students that do checklists, some don't like checklists, some do picture diagrams, some don't. Generally speaking, there's obviously a more increased level of organization when you move to secondary school. And we want to move away as much of that process from the traditional, maybe everybody else helping at home, to them becoming more autonomous and taking on some element of the responsibility. So this varies as to how this is set up. Are they in a set place? So does the school bag, the uniform and all the stuff stay together, or are they distributed, you know, near the front door? Is there a wall chart? Is there, you know, anything that really works, I suppose, in that setting? What I would say is that this does take time, and each student will take to this very differently. They may forget things regularly at the start, and they may leave stuff in school and vice versa. But I suppose that open element to, okay, let's resolve bits of the problem instead of it being, you know, a total catastrophe. Students will regularly forget their homework journal. Seems to be the most common one for us over the last few months, with lots of students, and pens and pencil cases. I'm not really sure why they're the two most topical subjects. And it's either that they're under pressure, they're in a rush, they leave them here at home because they've been doing homework in the morning, or they've been doing it in the car. And those things will happen, right, for all age groups. But it's, I suppose, devising a set system to do that. And we would look in that in a little bit more detail. If people have specific organization questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. But just because of time, I'll just move through. So learn, educate, strategies, environments, and routines. So from, let's say, maybe a parent or a teacher perspective, or, you know, even if you have a learning difference yourself that are on this evening, and we said this a bit at the start, but it's kind of creating that element. This is unfortunately, an ongoing journey, that there is new things always coming out. Every second week now there's a new app, or there's a new thing that does X, Y, Z. And, you know, it's kind of that staying up to date as much as possible. We're all bombarded with a phenomenal amount of information, but there are probably 3 or 4, you know, main, let's say, bodies in the world that look after, you know, dyslexia and look after learning differences, that if you stay up to date with some element of their research, that can probably give you a really good backing as to then go into a school system and try and stand your corner, let's say, is put in a polite way. Educating others, so trying to obviously share information with others, so it prevents inaccuracies. Best ways to learn, calm and purposeful environment, and routines. So routines and a clear plan. I know we've suggested some bits of that today, so won't go through it anymore. Confidence, resilience. Again, this is obviously a massive one as we transition from primary to secondary school, and massive really for most students at that age group anyway. The main ones here is the celebrating achievements. Okay, so an achievement isn't something that is, this massive. You might go on mute again for me, guys. Sorry. Um, so it isn't about celebrating these massive achievements of, oh, they got all of these tests right, or they got back their Christmas exams. These can be just like weekly wins. These can be sometimes every day at the start. We went in today, what did we get done? Did we, make a new friend? Any of those small things can really be building that confidence, building that element of resistance that they then learn how to do it for themselves. So as we develop and as we grow and mature, we do need to learn how to be able to give bits of that to ourselves. But at the start, when we're learning and we're small, we don't know how to really do that. So I suppose teaching a student and teaching a child and at home or in a classroom how to be able to acknowledge themselves and kind of pat their own self on the back is very, very useful for them to become, autonomous in that sense. Limiting social media, I won't fully get into social media. It's obviously a very topical conversation, particularly for teenagers. But where possible, obviously having boundaries with that, and then treating others or treating yourself as a student like you treat somebody else. So they're having a really tough time transitioning in, or they're finding things really difficult or finding a subject, maybe asking them, okay, well, if this was a friend of yours, what might you say to them? Generally speaking, they'll probably come up with the answer quite quickly, but giving them that scope to I suppose be able to articulate it. Some home tips, so kind of a little bit of a crash course here in one slide. Homework, desk and posture. Okay, so ideally setting things up in the best way possible, so that obviously chair alignment, so it's not stretched up and you're not stretched back, you're not hunched over, as best as possible. Noise levels, timers, we've mentioned those. Plans, we went over those. Shelving, filing systems, checklists, obviously with more and more subjects leads more element for chaos with notes. Okay, and there's a little bit of a move away from that again with COVID. There aren't many sheets or handouts, let's say, given by teachers, but they still can be quite regular. So they still can be, projects. There still can be obviously exam paper questions handed out and printed out as samples. So having bits of that system is going to be very, very useful. Color coding, obviously lots of people do this anyway, even for primary school kids anymore, which was a little bit unheard of a long time ago. It was just kind of more secondary school focused, whereas I feel like a lot of younger students now are getting into this mindset too, which will probably set them up a little bit better for a secondary school process. Regular movement, obviously regularly moving around. We won't go into all of that, obviously that's fairly self-explanatory. I know we have a few teachers on, so I'll briefly run through this. And again, this can kind of apply to home, so it doesn't have to be specific to a teacher strategy. Font size, so we would be very keen on specific font. There is dyslexia, orientated font that often is quite difficult actually for some students to read, we're finding recently, so it may not be always the best approach. So we would generally suggest kind of a size 14, 12 is a little bit too small, and 16 is often a little bit too big. Limiting white backgrounds and color overlays. I'm not sure if people are using color overlays or it's kind of linked in with Earlin lenses, but generally there's a color tint. So color tint, kind of a laminated sheet that goes over a page that can change, the mundane white page into something a little bit more exciting. Subheadings, bullet points, limiting the use of red pens, movement breaks, visual cues, speaking slowly, not loudly. We get this as a very regular question. It's about illustrating a point to a child or to a student instead of obviously, raising your voice to them. It's not that they can't understand. It's not that they can't hear you. It's just that they may take like a second or two longer to understand what you're saying. Okay, so I'll just run through a little bit about a follow-up and then we'll go through some questions. So a few additional things that we do run a parent group. So I know Amy runs a different parent group, which is great. But we run a parent group, which is also for teachers as well, but mainly for parents. And where we get on guest speakers, and we do this on a regular basis, on a monthly basis. So feel free if any of these are of interest to anybody. I suppose our main thing is we do work with students directly on a secondary school transition program. So this usually takes place kind of in June, July. But also we carry out one in August. where we go into level of detail as to what it's like with the transitioning in, what are all the things to look out for, what they need to do for the first few weeks. And it's a very, very detailed program that we look at with that. If they're students, you know, if they're variants of students that are transitioning in and maybe feel like they could benefit a little bit more, hopefully, obviously, we can add some extra help to them. This is our online program where we do look an awful lot more into the assistive technology. Again, if people ask set questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Didn't have time, obviously, to go through everything, but we do a huge range of assistive technology modules and details in this. So this course program can be accessed on our website, where we have a range of 5 modules to get a very good overview of how to help a student at home or how to help a student in the classroom. Okay, and lastly, acceptance. So I always end some of these with a little bit of a quote, and I find this one very funny of, you know, resisting things and accepting things. And as we transition and as a student transitions from one setting to the next, there can often be a lot of resistance, there can often be a lot of struggle, there can often be a lot of stress involved in that. And it's about accepting, for the most part, the student has X amount of years left in the school system and how best can we move through that. So working with them as a more of a collaborative approach of how they can accept that this is a change happening, and then how can we put a plan in place to move through that easily. I will do a feedback form, guys, if anybody has any things that they want to suggest in here. Obviously it's all anonymous, so I will put that in the chat. And thank you for listening, and I'd be delighted to go through all of your questions.
Thanks so much, Una.